Spider-Man is one of my favorite superheroes, which is why it's crazy I haven't made a video on him until now. I've seen every Spider-Man film many times, and before we start, I would just like to say that I love them all, even those that don't have the best rep. I've now seen Far From Home twice, and I absolutely love it, so now it's time to break it down. Being a now graduated film student, I love breaking movies down and comparing them to other films similar to them. So in this video, I'm going to review the film and explain why it's the best live-action Spider-Man movie so far, go over the post-credit scenes, and explain what's to come for the future of Spider-Man in the MCU. Now, I'm not going to compare this and the other live-action Spider-Man films to the animated films, most notably the Oscar-winning movie Into the Spider-Verse, because I feel it's just not comparable, as the live-action films are set much more in reality than the animated ones. Now, there will be major spoilers for this film, many of the other Avengers movies, and all of the live-action Spider-Man movies. So if you haven't seen them yet and don't want to be spoiled, add this to your watch later playlist and come back after you've seen them. Now, let's get started.
Oh my god.
The plot of this film is very different than the other Spider-Man films, even its predecessor Homecoming, because it's a follow-up to perhaps the biggest superhero movie of all time, and by far the most important Marvel Cinematic Universe film. So it had a lot of hype and a lot of expectations, and in my opinion, I think they came through and met those expectations. While this is the second MCU Spider-Man movie, it's actually Tom Holland's 5th time playing the character, something that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield did not have under their belt when they made the sequel to their films. Tom Holland was incredible as always. He is my favorite Spider-Man without a doubt, and I'll go into more detail as to why I think that in a minute. And just to name some other great performances in Far From Home, there was Zendaya as MJ, Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio, and Jon Favreau as Happy, and they were all incredible as well. Because Far From Home was the follow-up to Endgame, there were so many questions unanswered, and for the most part, they answered many of them. It gave us a name for Thanos' snap, calling it the blip, and they really showed the consequences of it. We find out that the kids that disappeared came back and stayed the same age 5 years later, and the kids that didn't disappear grew 5 years older in that time span. This messes with all of the kids' ages, and we even hear one kid say that his younger brother is now older than him. They also show a hilarious scene where the band comes back 5 years later and interrupts a basketball game, causing chaos. We also hear May talking about how she went back to her apartment, and the new residents thought that she was a ghost or a mistress. It's very interesting to see this side of the snap, something that other films never seem to do. There could be a huge event, but we can never see the repercussions of it. The MCU did a great job following up from Infinity War and Endgame in the most unlikely but fascinating way. One thing that I really liked is how they drew the MCU into Far From Home even more, showing that there are documentaries on the events that have happened, like Wakanda being revealed, the snap, Tony Stark, and much more. We also find out that Peter literally studies Thor in his class, which was not only a funny line, but it also shows very accurately what it would be like if this actually happened in the real world. It's a part of history, which is really cool to think about. We also see the consequences of those that died or left the franchise in Endgame, showing a poorly done tribute video for Tony, Steve, and Natasha. It comments on a sad event, topped with a funny way of doing it, which set the tone for the film brilliantly. Tony's death takes center stage in this film, and I find it really interesting how they did this. In the other Spider-Man films, and of course in the comics, Peter losing his Uncle Ben always stayed with him at his core, and was what drove him to become a better hero. In the MCU, however, this had already been done in 2 franchises, and it would have been overkill to do it a 3rd time, although they did give a good nod to him in Far From Home when Peter used his uncle's suitcase for his trip, having the initials BMP on it. In the MCU, they turned Tony Stark into the figure that Ben was in other adaptations. This is probably one of the best moves the MCU has made over the course of their 23 films, because who better for Peter to look up to and eventually lose in the face of the franchise? We saw the development for the relationship in 4 films before this. This makes it even more devastating and makes it mean much more to the audience when Peter loses his heroic figure. We barely knew Ben Parker in the first 2 franchises because we only see him for the first half of one film. There's not much time to develop Peter and Ben's relationship in the other franchises, whereas in the MCU, we've had years to watch Peter and Tony's relationship grow. This film picked up right at Peter's low point, losing a friend, mentor, and ultimately a father figure. And in this movie, he sees him everywhere he goes, which is just heartbreaking. And not only that, but the writers made this loss an even heavier burden because everyone expects Spider-Man to take the place of Iron Man. And for most of the film, Peter doesn't think he can do this. People literally ask him if he's the head Avenger now, what he'll do if aliens come back, and all that Peter wants to do is be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The man we thought to be Nick Fury pushes him even more, saying that Stark chose him as an Avenger.
You're an Avenger now.
And maybe he chose wrong, a line that seriously hit home with Peter and the audience. Tom Holland perfectly plays the disappointment and loathing of himself. He wants to be a normal kid, but he knows that that's not an option. He's so desperate to get there that he hands his position over to the villain of the story.
Welcome to the Avengers.
And then he becomes even more disappointed because he handed the only thing that Tony left for him to the bad guy. They also mention one of my favorite lines from Homecoming, which I think perfectly shows Peter and Tony's relationship.
I just wanted to be like you.
And I wanted you to be better.
And now in Far From Home, that line means so much more. That's why Tony chose Peter, because he knew that Peter was better than him. This line is explored even more in one of my favorite scenes from Far From Home, when Peter and Happy talk about Tony, and Happy tells Peter that Tony questioned himself on every decision that he made, but the one thing that he was sure about was choosing Peter. It was also great to have Jon Favreau's character say this, because he was of course the director of the original Iron Man films that kicked off this universe, so hearing him talk about Tony being his best friend was very touching. And the scene that follows is incredible. We see Peter use Tony's tech and literally look just like his hero Tony, and the icing on the cake was playing the famous song that is now synonymous with the Iron Man character.
I need a suit.
Suit? You take care of the suit. I'll take care of the music.
And again, it's fitting that Jon Favreau was the one that put the song on, because he had a huge part in choosing that song for the original Iron Man movie. Going back to Peter's character, I love how human and relatable they made him. We see him struggle, cry, get hurt, see him desperately limp to Happy and hug him. And even small things stick out to me, like him leaving his suit in the hotel room because he didn't want to be Spider-Man while on vacation.
I left my suit in the hotel room. Why? Because I'm on vacation, Ned. Everyone's gonna see my face. Just get them out of here. Go!
Something similar to a Spider-Man 2 scene with Tobey Maguire, but here it just feels more natural. And him being so relatable as a human being is literally carried over from the first Tom Holland Spider-Man film in one of my favorite scenes where he cries, saying that he can't lift the building off of him.
No! Please! Hey, please! I'm down here! I'm down here! I'm stuck! I can't move! I can't...
Again, it's just so real and so relatable. I've never related more to a superhero than Tom Holland's Spider-Man, and this film just set that in stone even more. And staying on the topic of Tom Holland, let's discuss why I think he's the best live-action Spider-Man. First of all, he's actually a high school kid. For the most part, Spider-Man in the comics is very young, and it just felt weird having Tobey Maguire be 27 playing a high school kid. And they of course realized this, and had him graduate high school to move on to his college years. But again, it's not the Spider-Man that I wanted to see. I wanted a younger high school version of Peter Parker, and in the Amazing Spider-Man franchise, they actually did this. They gave us a high school Peter Parker, but it was even stranger to have Andrew Garfield, a 29-year-old, and later a 31-year-old playing a high school kid. Tom Holland started the MCU out as a 19-year-old, and here he's 23, which is literally my age. This is the age that I want to see somebody play Peter Parker, and it's even better because Tom Holland is very young looking.
Jesus, Tony, how old is this guy?
I don't know, I didn't carbon date him, he's on the young side.
The writer for Holland's Spider-Man also hit the mark on balancing his awkwardness with his coolness, which Maguire and Garfield's Peter could not do. Maguire was too much on the dorky side, and Garfield's was too cool and not geeky enough. Holland had the perfect amount of nerdiness and awkward tendencies, but still had a cool side to him. It's literally right from the comic pages and adapted to the real world and for the big screen. And if that wasn't enough, Tom Holland is an amazing gymnast and can literally do some things that the real Spider-Man can do. He does many of his own stunts, and it just makes the acting and the character more authentic.
Okay, Spider-Man! Don't flip!
And moving past just the actors, I think the MCU has the best Spider-Man portrayal. They show his strength very well, which the other films did not do a great job of. In the first film that Tom Holland was in, Civil War, he carries a huge airport loading dock, and in Far From Home, they show it even better. In this film, he literally says that he's super strong, and they show this with him breaking a lock with his bare hand, accidentally knocking Flash out without meaning to, not knowing his own strength, and breaking the seatbelt in Fury's car by accident as well. They also show his spider senses better than any of the other films. They were briefly shown in the other live-action movies, but weren't mentioned often, but here they talk about it a lot. We first saw this in Infinity War, where his hair sticks up on the bus, and in Far From Home, they flesh it out even more. Here of course they call it the Peter Tingle, which is hilarious.
Do not start calling it my Peter Tingle.
And I imagine for the future they're eventually going to call it his spider sense. One of the coolest scenes was his final showdown with Mysterio, where he relies on his spider sense to make his way through Mysterio's illusions. It was by far the best use of the spider sense that we've seen in live action. I also love that they show his web shooters, which the original trilogy did not do, making it look like he was just able to shoot it out of his hand, which I never liked, though the Amazing Spider-Man showed his web shooters as well, and they did a pretty good job of it. Now let's look at the overall plot of the movie. Much like Homecoming, this film was very different than the other MCU films, most of which focus on heavy action and have comedy and romance take the back seat. In Far From Home, however, the action takes the backseat to the comedy and romance. There's a huge focus on relationships, most notably the relationship between Peter and MJ, but we also had Ned and Betty, Happy and Aunt May, and sort of MJ and Brad. And that's a lot for an MCU movie, even more than Homecoming had. Far From Home has a very different style and feel from the other MCU films, especially the main Avengers ones. If I had to categorize this, I would say it's a comedy romance movie, and if I had to categorize the other Avengers films, I would say that they were action, fantasy, and adventure films. Two very different kinds of movies. But in Far From Home, it's fitting to have this style, because this film is about kids, while the Avengers films are mostly about adults. Now, comparing this to the other Spider-Man films, I think that this outdoes them all. The Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield films had romance and comedy as well, but I don't think they were able to balance the two well, or balance the two with action as well as Far From Home did. Far From Home perfectly balances these three things, and each one of them complements the other. And even when it just comes to balancing the romance and comedy, there's one example from Far From Home that does this brilliantly. The scene where MJ tells Peter that she knows that he's Spider-Man.
MJ, I
am Spider-Man.
No, of course I'm not.
I mean, it's kind of obvious.
It's hilarious and at the same time adds more to their love story, both the comedy and romance complementing each other. And now let's take a look at how the other two franchises did the same reveal. Neither could match the perfect balance of comedy and romance that Far From Home had. The Tobey Maguire films lack comedy, which I think hurt the franchise. In Tobey Maguire's reveal, the scene is very serious compared to Tom Holland's. The two films went a completely different route, but ultimately, both were aiming for the same outcome, for a romantic scene. Both scenes were successful in the romantic part and made us feel for the characters, but how they followed up that moment is what makes the difference between one being better than the other. In Far From Home, right after the reveal, they discover Mysterio's plan and work together to try and fix it. She asks him all these questions that he can't answer, and it leaves the audience wanting more from the two. And ultimately, we get more seeing MJ run into Peter's arms and see the two kiss after he defeats the villain. It was worth the build up and was what we wanted to see. Now if we look at Tobey Maguire's reveal, right after MJ finds out, they pile a whole lot of drama literally 2 seconds after it. The moment doesn't have time to set in because we immediately go on to Peter having to catch a building. And to make it even worse, the reveal is pushed down even further when Doc Ock has a huge character moment and sacrifices himself to save them. Alone, that would have been a great scene, but following this romantic moment, it takes away from the reveal and makes us forget about it. In Far From Home, it left us wanting more, but here, it makes the reveal sort of irrelevant. With all of that piled on, we forget about MJ finding out his secret, and therefore don't crave more like we did for Holland. A reveal like that is simple writing, but the writers for Maguire's Spider-Man made it way more complicated than it had to be, because they made it extremely difficult to move the momentum back to Peter and MJ, by sticking perhaps the most important and interesting moment for a character whose arc dominated the film right after the reveal. It's almost impossible to get that momentum back to the relationship and the reveal. Meanwhile, if we look at Andrew Garfield's reveal to Gwen Stacy, that too is very underwhelming. This film tried to have some comedy in that reveal, focusing on the awkwardness of the situation. Peter stutters and can't get the words out.
I wish I could just...
And I see what they were going for, but all it leads to is an unnatural way of revealing a secret. Far From Home used the same awkward comedy, Tom Holland's Peter also stuttering, and here it worked perfectly. And the reason why that one felt more natural is because the film had already established that Peter and MJ were awkward people. Meanwhile, Andrew Garfield's Peter and Emma Stone's Gwen Stacy were made to be much cooler, which as I mentioned before is a whole nother problem. But when they tried to make these already established cool characters awkward, it just didn't flow. Let's look at the tone of each franchise. As I said, Far From Home is a high school movie that focuses on comedy and romance, and they hit the mark with both of those things. There were some seriously funny moments, and there were some very nice romantic parts that incorporated comedy, playing off the average awkward high schooler. And on top of that, they had some great action. Andrew Garfield's Amazing Spider-Man came out around the time of the gritty and Dark Knight trilogy that every superhero movie after that was trying to copy, so those films took a darker tone than the other Spider-Man films, and even the coloring of the film is made to look grittier and darker. This however is not done well, because the Dark Knight trilogy is all serious all the time, but the Amazing Spider-Man franchise constantly tries to be funny while having the dark tone to the overall film.
Is that a knife? Is that a real knife?
Yes, it's a real knife.
My weakness, it's small knives.
Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man wasn't as dark, but it certainly had its dark moments. The final fight between Peter and the Green Goblin was very adult, while if we look at the final fight in Far From Home, if we look at Green Goblin's death and Mysterio's death, there was much more focus on the Green Goblin's death, the film literally ending at his funeral, and it affected the rest of the trilogy. But in Far From Home, a much more upbeat and happy film, Mysterio's death was hardly touched upon, which for a film like this is very fitting. There's no need to fixate on that death when they had so much else going on. The Far From Home writers perfectly showed just enough of his death to make it mean something, but not enough to make it a dark and gritty death that affects the rest of the movie. There is one reason why Far From Home was able to balance these things so well compared to the other Spider-Man films, and it's simply because the MCU did such a great job setting up his character leading to this movie. The dark and sad things that happened to him happened in Endgame and Infinity War. They had 4 entire movies to make sure that these things were set in stone before this film.
I don't want to go. I don't want to go, sir. Please. Please, I don't want to go.
It's clear, however, how successful the Far From Home writers were, taking so much from previous films to adapt it to this film and make everything flow, which some of the previous Spider-Man films were not able to do. Now let's talk about the villains. The villains in the original Spider-Man trilogy and the first Amazing Spider-Man film were simply put incredible, minus Venom in the third film. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had some garbage villains, but moving on. The villains from the original trilogy and the first Amazing Spider-Man film all had deeper reasons as to why they were bad and had an end goal that made sense. However, time after time, we've seen the same formula. A person who doesn't start out bad, but ultimately goes down that path due to an event that happened or an experience that went wrong. Even Homecoming followed this formula with Vulture. In Far From Home, the villain is not only unique, but also ties this film to the other MCU films in a way that no one expected. I love how Tony was essentially responsible for this villain and his crew to be created. They're incorporating our favorite hero and the face of the franchise even after he's gone. The scene when they bring us back to the very first MCU film,
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave!
And later to Civil War, showing an old scene with Tony blew my mind.
Binarily augmented retro framing, or BARF.
And I thought it was so creative and unique. And comparing this to Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 tried to do the same thing and bring us back to the first film with Uncle Ben's killer. Both Ben and Tony meaning the same thing to the 2 different Peters of each franchise, the man who inspired them to become a hero. I think we can all agree though that Far From Home did this much better. Spider-Man 3 trying to bring us back to the first film just felt forced and out of place. It was just a jumbled mess. In Far From Home, however, it's once again so natural the way the writers did it. They didn't go the easy route the way the other films did. They came up with a very interesting and well thought out story for a villain who couldn't be so big that it was an Avengers level villain, but not too small that Peter's job was too easy. He was the perfect threat level and pushed Peter to the ground a few times, both mentally and physically. Mysterio, in my opinion, is not the best villain that we've ever seen in a live action Spider-Man film, but he's certainly the most unique and the most fitting for the film that he was in. And the final thing I'm going to compare between the live-action Spider-Man films before I go over the post-credit scenes and the future of the MCU is the Spider-Man suits. One of the best parts of Spider-Man is his suit, and the MCU has outdone themselves with the suits over the years. When the MCU first revealed their Spider-Man, he had a suit that had the eyes that move just like in the comics. This is something that Maguire and Garfield's Spider-Man lacked, and it might seem like a small detail, but it's small details like that that make a great film and a great adaptation of a character. The other franchises had great suits, but they stayed relatively the same throughout, and felt boring compared to the MCU. The Amazing Spider-Man suit is probably my least favorite, especially the mask with the sunglass sort of eyes. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 did a little better with the eyes, but again, it was sort of boring. And Maguire's pretty much stayed the same throughout all 3 films, with the addition of the black suit. And at the time they were great, but compared to the MCU, it's weak. And that's of course due in large part to the advancements in filmmaking since then. In Far From Home, we saw all 4 of the suits that he has worn in the MCU. First, the Iron Spider suit, which is absolutely incredible, and is in my opinion, the best live action superhero costume of any superhero film. When he's on vacation, he of course goes back to the original one that Tony made for him, which I mentioned before. Then we get a brief moment with the sweatsuit that he made before meeting Tony in Civil War. And we got 2 new suits in this film. The Night Monkey suit, which was really cool and really well done. And of course, the new suit that Peter makes on his own, which is taken straight out of the very first Spider-Man comic book with the webbed wings and everything. But the biggest thing that sets the MCU suits apart from the other 2 franchises is that they have the technology that Tony, the face of the MCU, created. It was again a great way to fit Holland's Spider-Man into the MCU and makes all of his suits so cool. And we can't go without mentioning Edith, which stands for Even Dead I'm the Hero, a perfect last gift for Peter that shows Tony's ego one last time. Now, I couldn't make a video on Far From Home without discussing the end credit scenes, which might be the best end credit scenes in any MCU film, which is really saying something. The mid-credit scene is the biggest and most important one, with Mysterio and J. Jonah Jameson revealing Peter's secret identity. Not only was it awesome to see the same actor, J.K. Simmons, back in the role of Jameson, but the scene might be one of the most shocking scenes in all of the MCU, and leaves us with so many questions. It mirrors the end of the last film, with Aunt May finding out that Peter is Spider-Man. But here, of course, it's on a much larger scale. After seeing this, I immediately thought of the comic series Civil War, where Peter revealed himself to the world and made all of his enemies go after his friends and loved ones. This kicks off phase 4 of the MCU and reveals the problems that Peter will have to face in his next film. So what's to come next? Well, the second post-credit scene might have answered this. We see that Fury was not actually on Earth during this film, Talos and his wife from Captain Marvel taking his and Maria Hill's place, and the real Fury was actually in space with the Skrulls on what looks like the Sword Station from the comics. This opens the door to many new threats, not just on Earth, but galactic threats as well. Clearly, Fury is preparing for big galactic threats, like the Celestials, the Annihilators, and even Galactus. So I think Phase 4 will focus on this, especially after Captain Marvel, who opened the door to many more potential space stories. But what's in store for Tom Holland's Spider-Man specifically? Well, his original contract from 2016 said that he would have 3 solo films and 3 other MCU projects. If this is right, he's already done 3 MCU projects with Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame, and has now done 2 of the 3 solo films. So he will have another solo film for sure, but he might not be in any more Avengers films. This all depends on future contracts made with Holland. We saw this happen with Robert Downey Jr., who renegotiated his contract with the MCU multiple times. But there's also the whole Marvel and Sony thing, as the two are currently sharing the rights to this version of Spider-Man. Hopefully Marvel and Sony's relationship sticks, and Tom Holland renegotiates his contract so that we can have more Peter in the MCU. Overall, this film was great, and is my favorite live-action Spider-Man film. I explained why I thought that, and some of you might disagree, and that's totally fine. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. You can follow me on social media. Links for that will be in the description. And I want to give a huge shout out to all my Patrons listed below. If you want to be listed on my next video, plus a bunch of other rewards, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you press that subscribe button to help grow the channel. Again, thank you so much for watching, and look out for more great videos on the way.